Very good. Yes, I told someone, I think it was Dr. Faulkner, or Falconer, maybe I'm not pronouncing that correctly, and Dr. Dahmers, that my experience with SATs was one of the best I've ever had. I already had one doctorate from a school here in America, a very good Harding School of Theology, but SATs was really a much better process. They engaged me and helped me to write my thesis, and I really appreciated it. If you're looking for a wonderful guy to guide you as well, Dr. William Dahmers is the man. I love Dr. Dahmers. He's done a great job for me, and I'm very satisfied with the SATs experience and recommend it very highly.
Oh, fantastic. That's so good to hear that there's a good testimony coming from your side as well. Well, over to you. You are welcome to start. What we're going to do is we're going to give you about 40 to 45 minutes. And then afterwards, if anybody has a question, they are welcome to pose it to you as well. So I'm going to hand over to you and I'll do the slides for you.
Very good. Thank you, Rudolph, for the introduction. And I want to thank Marno for the wonderful slide presentation I'm viewing right now. I truly am pleased to be with you and the listening audience. I know it's not a great time in South Africa, but it is morning here. And so I'm hopeful we'll have some folks watching. I do have a full manuscript, but I'm going to try to be conversational as well. I've often found that a full manuscript, even when I was preaching for 35 years, kept me on track, and I didn't go down, as we call it in the States, pig trails. If you get off on a pig trail sometimes, that makes a 30-minute sermon become a 45-minute sermon, and people don't like that very much. Anyway, as the first PowerPoint slide indicates, our topic is archaeology and the Bible. Two disciplines that very often seem to be at odds with one another, depending upon which camp you pitch your tent in, either the archaeological data camp or the biblical text camp. And as further noted, I'll be presenting material discovered during the lengthy process of completing the Doctor of Theology at the South African Theological Seminary under the guidance of Dr. William Bill Dahmers. My research was directed toward the question of how ancient Israel emerged in the land of Canaan in the 13th century BC, with an eye toward presenting a model of coherence between archaeology and the Bible. What I'd like to do this morning, and it is morning here, as I said a moment ago, is to begin by sharing with you how I first became interested in the study. I think you can go to, well, you've got it there, very good. Maybe the next slide. And I want to begin by sharing with you how I got interested, then followed by a brief review of how various models have been proposed over the last 90 plus years and some of the proponents. A third thing I'd like to do is examine the two major source documents that tell the tale, if you will, of Israel's arrival in Canaan, namely Judges and Joshua. And fourth, will be profitable to take a few moments to look at the importance of the early excavations at the large Canaanite mounds or tells, and how that data impacted later the development of the surface, regional surface surveys. And then fifth, I want to introduce to you a new perspective of how Israel settled in Canaan, and then followed by the sixth and final segment of my presentation, and that will be looking at the eclectic model that proposed by my thesis and noting some of the areas of coherence and cohesion. I was watching some previous interviews, and I noted that the presenter asked that questions be held until the end of the presentation. I would also make that request, and I look forward to trying to answer any questions that you might formulate during listening to my presentation. I was first introduced to the difficult task of properly associating the material culture unearthed during an excavation project with the biblical text during the early days of excavating at Tel Bet Shemesh, Israel. I first began working at Tel Bet Shemesh, Israel in 2000. Now, if you're not familiar with Israel, Tel Bet Shemesh is an ancient site. It's located about 16 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It's built right up against the the mountains there, and the Shephelah begins, and it's about 25 miles from the coast. Dr. Dale W. Manor, professor of Bible and archaeology at Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas, is the field director. And over 16 seasons, I've worked under the direction of Dr. Manor. He has become a dear friend and mentor. It was during a lecture presented by Dr. Manor at Faulkner University in Montgomery, Alabama in 2012 that I first developed a keen interest in researching and writing my dissertation. Dr. Manor's presentation covered the proposals for the origin of Israel in Canaan that had been offered in the 20th and the 21st centuries. Manor shared also a quote from Abraham Faust, a well-respected Israeli professor and archaeologist, that caught my attention and was the spark, so to speak, that lit the fire for my project. Faust said in regard to the proposals for the origin of Israelites in Canaan, and I quote, "The consensus today is that all previous suggestions have some truth regarding the origins of ancient Israelites. The percentage and weight given to each process varies." Manor went on to say that Faust had done an excellent job with using archaeology and anthropology, but that he had failed to integrate biblical elements into the narrative. And thus, I was off and running to formulate a plan to deal with archaeological data and integrate the biblical text into the discussion concerning the origin of or emergence of ancient Israel in Canaan. I decided to investigate the topic by comparison, the integration of pertinent biblical texts, those relating to Israel and Canaan, and the archaeological data that had already been surfaced during earlier digs and any new information I might find. From the outset, it was never my intention to somehow denigrate archaeology in favor of lifting up the Bible. Rather, I approached each discipline as having a role to play in the question of the origins of Israel and Canaan. I was careful not to approach the subject of coherence or convergence between the archaeological data and the biblical text from, as David Merling noted, the outdated prove the Bible mode. Instead, it was and still is my contention that both disciplines, archaeological data and the biblical text, have different yet important roles in trying to determine how ancient Israel emerged in Canaan in the 13th century BC. I also made it clear that it is my belief that neither archaeology, material data, nor the biblical text, the Bible, can answer every question raised during an excavation project at a mound or a regional surface survey. However, it is my contention, and I believe my work demonstrates this, that one should approach the question of the emergence of ancient Israel in Canaan, or any other question you're asking, drawing on a coherence theory model. And I'll have more to say about that in the final moments of the presentation. Let me say a few words about the scholars associated with the different models for the emergence of Israel in Canaan. The first scholar and the model he proposed is referred to by most as the biblical model or the CONQUEST model. Its main proponent was the Orientalist William Foxwell Albright of Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. As an Orientalist, that is one who could work with multiple ancient and modern languages in a range of scholarly fields, Albright brought a certain credibility founded in his archaeological work as he attempted to blend the Bible and archaeology using archaeology as an external evidence. By 1935, he had become the authority in American archaeological circles, and in his 1935 article dealing with the Israelite settlement conquest, he proposed that enough evidence had been found to finally frame a chronological outline of the Israelite conquest and settlement. Albright's conquest model was dubbed the biblical model, basically because it tells the same story that's found in the biblical narrative of Joshua. Although Albright, over the period of time, admitted that his model had to be adjusted or altered somewhat, he continued until his death to believe that the primary origin of Israel and Canaan was brought about by military conquest. Albright had been accused of leaning too much in favor of Bible over archaeology. However, if you read his writings carefully, you'll note that he believed that archaeological data was the final word, not the biblical text. The conquest model would be abandoned by most archaeologists as new evidence was surfaced and a closer look at the biblical text, particularly Joshua, came to the forefront. Now, for your reference, if you're interested, the Israeli archaeologist by the name of Yigael Yadin, a great statesman, a great soldier, and a great archaeologist, was the major proponent in Israel of the Albright's conquest model. The second model, the peaceful infiltration model, introduced by leading German Protestant theologian Albrecht Alt and his student Martin Noth, proposed that Israel eventually came into existence in Canaan by way of groups of pastoralists peacefully infiltrating the land, followed by, after a period of time, and they don't say how long that would be, violent confrontations by which they eventually secured all the land of Israel. Alt made it clear that his primary purpose was to really go against Albright and another guy named Mendenhall in the conquest and the peasant models. That brings us to the peasant revolt model of Mendenhall and Gottwell, known as the peasant revolt model, or as they later named it, the social revolution model. Mendenhall and his student Norman Gottwell proposed that the rise of Israel was brought about by an internal revolt by the Canaanite peasantry who had had enough of the corrupt overlords and the governing kings of the Canaanite city-states. Thus they rebelled and took over the cities, eventually identifying themselves as Israel. Gottwall explained greatly and clarified Mendenhall's theory while taking a different view as to how the revolt eventually took place. Whereas Mendenhall saw a component of religion in the land by this band of wanderers coming out of Egypt and introducing Yahweh to the peasant revolt, Gottwall took the position that the revolt was fueled only by the peasants' desire to overthrow the corrupt Canaanite authorities with no religious involvement at all. In Gottwall's magisterial, I can never say that word, in his great work, some 900 pages, The Tribes of Yahweh, he set forth his peasant or social revolution idea. As we see later on, this model, as well as with some other models, answered some questions, but raised a lot more questions than it answered. Another model, the symbiosis hypothesis model, Volkmar Fritz introduced the symbiosis hypothesis in the mix of theories. Now, symbiosis is not in my everyday vocabulary. I don't think I've used it in a long time. I suspect it's not in yours either. So by brief definition, symbiosis is interaction between two different organisms living in close physical association, typically to the advantage of both. Also, a mutual beneficial relationship between different groups of people living together. Fritz viewed this living together in close proximity or physical association as taking place because of the entry, and again, his was a peaceful entry, by pastoral groups who were not nomadic only, but had periods of sedentary life as well interspersed with their nomadic lifestyle. Then he said at some point, these Israelites decided to stay in the regions of central Canaan, where they developed a symbiotic life existence between themselves and the Canaanites living in the towns of the city-states. This eventually, according to Fritz, led to the nation of Israel emerging as a power in Canaan. Fritz says that this is the only way to explain their wide-ranging adoption of Canaanite culture, the only way to explain the similarities between the Israelites and the Canaanites during that last phase of the late Bronze Age as we moved into the Iron Age 1. I'll refute that later in my presentation. Fritz maintained there are three texts that support his theory. He says the Merneptah Stele, circa about 1207 BC, provides indisputable evidence of Israel's defined as a people in Canaan. Accordingly, this view is vitiating Fritz and Finkelstein's symbiosis hypothesis, according to Bempson in his 1989 article. He goes on and says the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, according to Fritz, clearly shows that the Israelites had already adopted a sedentary way of life, with the battle mentioned taking place around 1100 BC. Therefore, there was a definite form of coexistence between the Canaanites and the Israelites, with any attempt to change the balance resulting in military action. Third, he says, the unconquered city list in Judges chapter 1, verse 27. The list is likely from the days of King Solomon. And again, he points out this demonstrates a coexistence of the original inhabitants along with the Israelite tribes, which can be explained only by the fact that the country was not conquered, but rather it was taken over a period of time, a long period of time. Israel Finkelstein is said to have put more teeth into the symbiosis model with his extensively documented work on the Israelite settlement patterns written in 1988. However, Finkelstein differed from Fritz in that his symbiotic relationships occurs between indigenous nomads and the sedentary people, whereas Fritz's nomads came from outside the country in a fashion similar to the peaceful infiltration movement. Finkelstein interprets the events as nothing out of the ordinary, certainly not supernatural, but instead the Israelites were an evolutionary development of the land and the political climate. Like the peasant revolt model, the symbiosis model does not see the Israelites as ethnically related, but rather they came together to form Israel out of circumstantial means. Finkelstein says these people were hill country residents of Canaan in the process of changing their lifestyle. He says a couple of generations earlier, they would not have seen themselves as Israelites. It was during the lecture at Faulkner University in 2012 that Dr. Manor coined the term AUTO-ETHNOGENESIS. In so doing, Dr. Manor was referring to a permutation of the peasant revolt model. Israel emerged as a result of indigenous Canaanites resisting a Philistine takeover of their culture. Shlomo Bunamovitz and Zvi Letterman, a couple of directors where I dig at Tel Bet Shemesh, and William Deaver take this position. This resistance took the form of a radical change in their lifestyle and culture, a self-generating new identity, Israelites, and a new religion of Yahweh. As with other models, adherents often work from the same basic premise while traveling down a different road to reach the goal. This is the case with Bunamovitz and Letterman versus Deaver. What Manor referred to as track one was Bunamovitz and Letterman's basic contention that the Canaanites living at Bet Shemesh attempted to resist the Philistine culture taking them over and intentionally resisted by becoming Israelites. That led them to stop eating pork and also to begin to worship this new God, Yahweh. Deaver, track two, viewed the AUTO-ETHNOGENESIS as not so much a people fleeing from the Canaanite or the Philistines, but rather Canaanites who were dissatisfied with their society, and they sought to self-identify with a new society, seeking, as he said, a kind of utopia on earth. Ultimately, this indigenous population seeking a new identity, this AUTO-ETHNOGENESIS, emerged coming to see themselves as Israelites. Take a little sip of water here if you don't mind. Sorry about that. I want to briefly mention the conquest by imagination model. The minimalist school of thought basically says that no history whatsoever can be found in the biblical text. It says that the Israelites were born from a painful experience of the indigenous Canaanite people as a literary construct in the process of putting together their history. I concur with one of the leading minimalist scholars, his own assessment by T.L. Thompson. He noted that the conquest by imagination theory is difficult. I therefore gave no credence and give no credence to any material by the minimalists. I do not believe that Israel was a product of some productive, creative Canaanite mind looking to create a history. Let's move on to the source documents. When one speaks of using the Bible, biblical text, in the archaeological discourse, it should be noted that the current attitude toward the use of the Bible is not very favorable. Two prominent Israeli archaeologists are on record as noting the problematic nature of the Bible has rendered it almost illegitimate. This is Bunamovitz and Faust in a book by Levy in 2010. It's safe to say that among modern archaeologists, a majority view the Bible as bringing little or nothing to the table when discussing archaeological matters. Bunamovitz and Faust referred to the Bible as a cultural document, which may be used to answer social and cultural questions, and then in a sense restore the Bible to its central place in the archaeological discourse of the biblical period. However, when one continues to read, it becomes clear that their reference to the Bible as a cultural document does not raise its value, in worth in terms of any contribution it might make to the overall question. Listen to the words of Bunamovitz and Faust, and I'm quoting them. While liberating the research agenda from the shackles of the Bible, it is rather the new approach to biblical archaeology suggested here that reinstates the Bible at the heart of the archaeological discourse of the Iron Age. And then they continue. From a cultural perspective, the Bible as an unconscious revelation is invaluable. I prefer to listen to Amnon Bentor, who contends, and rightly so, that if one eliminates the Bible from the archaeology of the land of Israel in the second and first millennia BCE, you have deprived it of its soul. So now you have some idea of what a person of faith is up against when trying to integrate the biblical text into the archaeological discussion. In terms of Judges and Joshua, William Deaver, certainly no staunch defender of the inspiration of the Bible, does note that the first category of evidence for the emergence of Israel and Canaan comes from the biblical texts themselves. Judges and Joshua stand out as the main sources to consult in regard to Israel's emergence in Canaan. Judges does present a significantly different and perhaps more accurate picture of the taking of the land of Canaan by the Israelite tribes than does the book of Joshua. After the demise of the conquest model, Joshua was viewed as problematic history, and more attention was directed toward Judges as a story, as most archaeologists would say, that it did not contradict the archaeological evidence. Clearly, the purpose of the book of Judges is to portray the unfolding history of Israel from the death of Joshua down to the advent of the monarchy, an era commonly referred to as the period of the Judges. Judges primarily presents a general picture of essentially rural society linked by common faith who were living in the turbulent times, where, as the text says, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. The first 3 chapters of Judges broadly outlines the conduct of the Israelites during the period of the Judges in regard to the gods and also in regard to the Lord himself. On the one hand, Judges 2:11 through 23 evokes an era in which the Israelites and the Canaanites lived side by side, sometimes peaceably, at other times they were fighting. On the other hand, Joshua reflects a more theologically based document, highlighting the direct involvement of the Lord in eventually securing the land of promise, a land that the Lord God had promised to Abraham and his descendants. A superficial reading of Joshua can give the impression that the Israelites occupied Canaan by means of a divine-enabled blitzkrieg that put them in control of the entire country, and all the Canaanites were destroyed or encouraged to leave. Certainly, Judges presents a different picture, as does a careful reading of Joshua presents a different picture as well. The theological message of Joshua is that God has given them the land. God has given the land to the Israelites. He has given it to them in spite of the fact that they have failed to follow through with his commands to take all the land and destroy all the inhabitants, serving as God's punishing force against the Amorites, the Canaanites, whom God waited patiently to turn back to him. They did not. So in essence, God is fulfilling his promise to Abraham and at the same time bringing a long-awaited and rightly deserved punishment to the Canaanites. Most people read the book of Joshua coming away with the idea that following the death of Moses, Joshua led the Israelite tribes in a well-planned and complete conquest of the land of Canaan, which included 3 military campaigns. But what is missing is a report of any conflict, any battles against the Canaanite cities in the central zone, the highlands of Canaan. Further, it is clear from the closing remarks of Joshua made to the nation prior to his death that they had not completely taken the land, thus they had not completely obeyed the Lord. Now, let's move on to the Canaanite mounds and surface surveys. The material found during the excavation of several large Canaanite mounds or tells early on was the major contributor to understanding the archaeological data compared to the biblical text. This was the case until the 1970s and onward, as the regional surface surveys brought a new dynamic in regard to the overall inquiry. As noted at several places in my thesis, one should allow the two distinct disciplines, archaeology and the Bible, to function independently of one another. That is, neither should dictate any specific agenda. When this formula is followed, it allows for coherence. It allows for convergence between the two disciplines to surface as material evidence is examined and intertwined with the biblical text and other source material, such as Merneptah stelae, Germana tablets, etc. It should also be noted that the archaeologist and the biblical scholar must accept the fact that there are and will continue to be instances where no coherence and no convergence is found. In such cases, neither discipline has trumped the other. It is just a fact. We just do not know. Both sources are valuable, but both have obvious limitations. When a parallel lines of evidence come together, the material data and the biblical text, William Dever refers to this as convergences. He goes on to say, when this occurs, we arrive at what historians often call the balance of probability, or what jurisprudence refers to as the preponderance of evidence. In such a case, it may not offer ironclad proof that either discipline can claim, but it offers all that we need to know to get on with meaningful lives. Dever said this in an article in VAR in 2017. When it comes to Jericho, one of the large Canaanite mounds, it seems to be a direct contradiction of the biblical text. For instance, at Jericho, Dame Kathleen Kenyon concluded that there is no evidence of any late Bronze Age occupation, and thus there was no city for Joshua to conquer. However, as our American National Football League referees often say, upon further review, Kenyon does concede that there apparently was some kind of occupation at the site in the second half of the late Bronze Age, but nothing more than that. Dr. Manor correctly observes that it would have been fairer to point out that no evidence of occupation has been located at Jericho, rather than to argue definitively, as Kenyon did, that it was not occupied at all at the time. Albright further noted that the results of excavations can be ambiguous. And if you do any reading in archaeology, you're going to come across this word several times. And if you go to a site and dig, you're going to come across this as we stand and look at what we've unearthed, and the evidence is quite ambiguous at times. And he goes on and says, and sometimes in apparent contradiction to the biblical tradition. Then he quotes, this is Albright, it does no justice either to the biblical text or to the archaeological data to allow evidence not uncovered, which was not recovered from the excavation of a small percentage of a tale's area, to establish or disprove a biblical event. Now, for the sake of time, the same or similar information that I've presented above could be applied also to Ai, to Hatzor, to Jerusalem, to Lachish, and also to Laish, which is ancient Dan. Before leaving the Canaanite mounds, let me say a few words about the impact the regional surface surveys had on the interpretation of the mounds. Following the Six-Day War in Israel in 1967, large archaeological surveys were conducted in the highlands of Israel and in the central highlands. Extensive surveys in regions of Judah and Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar and the Negev revealed the establishment of dozens of small settlements that may be considered Israelite. That's according to Ami Mazar in 1992. Intensive surveys carried out in the central zones revealed hundreds of sites, adding a new dimension to the understanding of the region. These surveys added important dimension to the interpretation of the data already surfaced from the excavation at the large Canaanite mounds. Finkelstein, rightly so, said this, it is impossible to come to grips with the settlement episode of Israelite history without a thoroughgoing acquaintance with at least one region of the hill country in which the events took place. There must be a combining of the excavations and the surveys, and in order to do so, one must study the archaeological components, the ecological elements, as well as the patterns of occupation during the periods immediately preceding and succeeding the time of the Israelite settlement. Now, a survey, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, is akin to what we've come to know in watching murder mysteries. I suspect in South Africa or wherever you're listening from, you like murder mysteries as much as I do. And in the murder mysteries, the first thing they do at a crime scene is they'll spread out and walk in a line looking for any kind of evidence. Well, a surface survey does the same thing, looking for signs that there was some form of occupation or some evidence of man passing through the area. Sometimes they'll do a small excavation, but most of the time they'll just record and move along. Now, in chapter 7 of my thesis, I offer what I refer to as a new perspective on the question of the settlement of Israel in Canaan. In this chapter, I take a more in-depth look at the models alluded to earlier in the thesis and a new dimension, namely interspersed at relevant points in chapter. I discuss pottery issues, ethnic markers as they relate to the continuity of the late Bronze Age material on into the Iron Age 1, etc. It is in this chapter that I began to show the preponderance of evidence in favor of there being a significant tightness of fit or a convergence in so many scenarios. Excuse me. In the case of the conquest model, it should be noted that Albright and others recognized that the model had flaws that needed to be explained. But this did not mean that Israel's invasion of the land of Canaan was not a military operation. As late as 1982, Yigal Yadin noted that in its broad outline, the archaeological record supports the narrative of Joshua and Judges, as Albright said. One must recognize that according to the book of Joshua, the conquest model was the plan that God gave to Joshua for execution as he led the Israelite army into Canaan. It was God's intention that Joshua would take the land of Canaan by use of military force, along with his direct divine intervention. And in so doing, not only did God fulfill his promise to Abraham and his descendants, but he also would use Israel as a punishing agent against the wicked Canaanite nation. In the initial victory at Jericho, it sent a shockwave across Canaan as news of the divinely led troops advanced on other Canaanite cities. The conquest model in Joshua should be viewed from a theological framework rather than a chronological review of a total military operation. Clearly, in both Joshua and Judges, it is obvious that the remnant of Canaanites are still in the land and are a snare to Israel. Just read Joshua 23:13. Israel would not be able to maintain herself on the pinnacle where the Lord had placed her, Joshua 23:15 and 24:19, because the Canaanites were still in the land. However, while recognizing that Joshua's account is highly theological in that it sets forth God's faithfulness in giving the land of Canaan promised to Abraham and his descendants, it is still a historical book, noting the impetus of Israel's move toward emerging in and eventually occupying Canaan. The theological component does not negate the fact that many battles such as Jericho and Ai and Hatzor and Lachish and others show significant convergence with the biblical text and the archaeological data, allowing for at least the possibility of these cities being destroyed or taken by the nation of Israel. For instance, Kenyon's findings at the large Canaanite mound of Jericho, according to Deaver, were a crushing blow to the conquest model. However, work by Volkmar Fritz and others suggested in the case of the destruction of Canaanite cities, there is no definitive answer as to who destroyed them. Thus, the Israelite military could be the ones. As in the case of Jericho, there is no concrete evidence that anyone other than the Israelites conquered the city of Ai. And it should be noted, as with other sites, much of the site identified as Ai remains unexcavated. At Hatzor, one of the 5 cities said to have been destroyed by the Israelites by fire, Yadin found evidence of a great conflagration or fire destroying the final late Bronze Age city. And in the lower part of the city in Hatzor, though not burned, there is archaeological evidence that basalt statues of Canaanite gods and kings of Canaanites were decapitated and pagan temple vessels were smashed to pieces. This desecratory destruction is normally attributed to the Israelites. Old Testament scholar Kenneth Kitchens and others agree with the assessment of Yadin and Ben-Tor that in the case of the destruction of Hatzor, the early Hebrews remained a feasible option. Yadin went so far as to say that the destruction of the late Bronze Age city is doubtless to be ascribed to the Israelite tribes, as related in the book of Joshua. The biblical text notes that clearly Joshua burned the city of Hatzor with fire. There is an ample reason to believe, or at least allow for the possibility, that the nation of Israel, under the leadership of Joshua, burned Hatzor and with religious fervor attempted to eliminate any thought of worshiping Canaanite gods or Canaanite kings. Similar scenarios, time permitting, could be illustrated in the case of Lachish, Laish, Dan, or Jerusalem. Clearly, the archaeological data and the biblical text do not appear to be as far apart as some would suggest. In the majority of the cases, there appears to be a high degree of coherence or convergence between the text and the material data. The peaceful infiltration model, allowing for a military component to enter the entry and the emergence in Canaan, one may view the evidence for a peaceful coexistence not from the point of view of nomads or semi-nomads entering peacefully into Canaan, but how about from the viewpoint that the settlements in the hill country and other parts of Canaan, where obviously Israelites and Canaanites lived side by side, was the result of Israelites' failure to complete God's plan. And thus they settled in the land as best they could. Often at peace, more often than not, they were oppressed and dominated by the pagan nations they allowed to live. This view offers a new perspective than the one offered by the peaceful infiltration model. Thus, the hundreds of small late Bronze and early Iron Age sites scattered throughout the central highlands of Israel are not settlements by peaceful nomadic, semi-nomadic tribes, but rather they're Israelite tribes who did not defeat the Canaanites. This new perspective is in line with the biblical account in Joshua and Judges that Israel failed to follow through with God's directives and thus lived in the land of Canaan alongside the Canaanites, sometimes at peace, at other times at conflict. The peaceful infiltration model offers absolutely no explanation as why the Bible tells such a different story of the origin of Israel. Now, the peasant revolt model or the social revolution model. The new perspective in regard to a revolt of any kind is shown in the component of the revolt as David interacts with King Saul. It's during this time, almost 200 years after the tribes of Israel emerged in Canaan, that David was emerging as the next king of Israel, a kingship that would see the nation of Israel finally fully emerge as the power in Canaan. Rather than some kind of Canaanite peasantry uprising as suggested by Mendenhall and Gottwald, and by the way, there's absolutely no evidence for such a revolt at the end of the late Bronze Age, if one wants to interject any kind of revolt into the emergence of Israel and Canaan, it would be the way in which outer fringe people of society, the downtrodden, the outcasts, those who felt left out, gravitated toward Israel, gravitated toward David. Listen to the words of the prophet Samuel in 22, verse 2, 1 Samuel 22, 2. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in the soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. And by the time you get to 1 Samuel 23, 13, David has 600 men. It is not a stretch of the imagination that when the Israelites entered the land of Canaan, there were Amorites, Canaanites, who disliked their current status in life and sought to improve, strike out against, take action by casting their lot with the invading Israelites. A new perspective is brought to light in my research in terms of the symbiotic relationship between the Israelites and the Canaanites, not so much as two entities living in proximity, mutually benefiting one another, but as having a kinship component. In other words, it was not, as Fritz said, nomads who lived a long time in close contact with the Canaanites and adopted some of the Canaanite material culture prior to settling down in the new villages. Instead, my thesis views the Israelite and Canaanites as combatants first and foremost, with whatever else that occurs after the initial battles and Israel's failure to do God's word being a secondary in nature. What if they were kinfolks? From this new perspective, it's clear that the military campaigns of Israel, if one examines a biblical text in regard to these military actions, a pattern of non-conflict is apparent. Non-conflict between the Israelite army and the Canaanite cities, particularly in the central portion of Canaan. You may recall that after the initial defeat of Ai and the final regrouping and taking of Ai, Joshua convened the tribes of Israel in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim for a covenant review ceremony, Joshua 8:23-25. Joshua had 6 tribes of Israel on one side of the mountainside, had 6 tribes on the other, Mount Ebal and Gerizim, with Joshua standing in the valley below. As Joshua addressed Israel, behind him, a short distance away, stood the Canaanite city of Shechem. The question, why didn't they fight? Why was this central area of Canaan not the scene of many fierce battles between the Canaanites and the Israelites? Let me remind you of a story found in Genesis 34. Jacob's daughter, Dinah, was raped by Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite. What followed was the revenge carried out by Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, who deceitfully dealt with Shechem and the men of the town and led them to be slaughtered by the sword because they could not fight back, since they were recovering from having been circumcised. All the wives and the children of Shechem and Hamor were taken into the family of Jacob. They, in essence, were incorporated into what would eventually become the Israelite nation. When the terrible famine comes and Jacob and his clan descend to Egypt, it's reasonable to assume that all the family went down. But perhaps after the famine, some of the family returned back to Canaan, back to their original source, maybe back to Shechem. Such an argument fits well with Abimelech's argument of matrilineal connection to Shechem in Judges 9:1-3. Now Abimelech, the son of Zerubbabel, went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them, and to the whole clan of his mother's family, "Say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 sons of Zerubbabel rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh." Perhaps after the famine, some of these people came back to Shechem rather than going down to Egypt with Jacob and Israel and the clan to live with Joseph. Why didn't they fight at Shechem in the central highlands of Canaan? They were kinfolks. This is another nice story of coherence or convergence between the biblical text and the archaeological data. For time's sake, I will not deal with the AUTO-ETHNOGENESIS model as to a new perspective. Quite frankly, I do not believe it offers much by way of contributing to the question of ancient Israel's emergence in Canaan. It makes little to no sense to me as to why a people would give up a perfectly fine, good staple product such as pork simply to resist the oncoming Philistines. And further, where in the world did the Canaanites, if they were Canaanites at Beth Shemesh, come up with the worship of Yahweh? And last, even if this had some validity, it hardly serves as a pattern of events all over the land of Canaan. I know of no other site that has been shown to react in such a way as suggested by the AUTO-ETHNOGENESIS model. And so, after looking at the model suggested by the emergence of Israel and Canaan from a new perspective, let's spend the remainder of our time together looking at the eclectic model that I proposed in my thesis. Eclectic, deriving ideals, style, or taste from a broad and diverse range of sources. The emergence of Israel and Canaan cannot be fully explained by one model, but rather the contribution of several models tells the story of how ancient Israel emerged in Canaan over a period of some 200 years. There's no doubt in my mind that the emergence of Israel and Canaan began as a military operation. This was the plan, the marching orders given by God to Joshua. The fact that Israel did not comply fully with God's command is illustrated over and over within the biblical text, as we see conflict between the Israelites and the Canaanites for some 200 years before David finally brings the country under full control. Therefore, the conquest model of Albright occupies a legitimate place in the overall eclectic model presented by my thesis. Further, the fact that Israel did not completely take the land of Canaan, did not annihilate the inhabitants to fulfill God's punishment for them, meant that the Israelites did, in some sense, coexist with the heathen Canaanites over a period of time, some 200 years. It was always an existence that was fraught with the tension of war, but nonetheless a certain peace existed. In this manner, a certain element of the peaceful infiltration model plays some part in my eclectic model. Peasant revolt model. There's no evidence of any kind of uprising in the Canaanite peasant revolt of any kind in the late Bronze Age. However, as noted, near the final stages of Israel becoming a dominant power, the ruler over the entire land of Canaan, there seems to have been a group of Canaanite outcasts, people who lived on the fringe of Canaanite society, who were attracted to the Israelite way of life and joined David for a shot at a better life. It is this component of revolt during the 200-year period that Israel lived in Canaan that qualifies for at least some consideration in an eclectic model such as my thesis proposes. As was the case with the peasant revolt model, an element of symbiosis in terms of kinship seems to be appropriate addition to the eclectic model I've set forth. The story of Hamor and Shechem and Abimelech seems to offer significant possible convergence with the fact that Joshua's forces did not engage the Canaanite cities and villages located in the central Canaan as the initial onslaught of Israel's army entered the land at the end of the late Bronze Age. As noted earlier, there's little to commend itself to the eclectic model in terms of the AUTO-ETHNOGENESIS, except the fact that perhaps you might put it in as ways people were self-identifying with Israel. The Canaanites on the fringe of society were self-identifying with them. Let me bring our session to a close by noting that the idea of a combination of various models to explain the emergence of Israel and Canaan is not an original proposal. However, my thesis has taken the concept a step further by incorporating or integrating biblical elements into the narrative. At various points in my thesis, I have demonstrated the numerous times that there is coherence between the archaeological data and the biblical text. I've also answered statements by Fritz and Deaver in regard to their saying the only way to explain the continuance of late bronze material culture into the Iron Age was to accept their particular model. I did so by integrating the biblical text that so clearly fits with the reality of the archaeological data. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 10. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you, with a great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant. And when you eat and are full, then take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Even though Israel did not fully take all the cities and possess all the land, what they did initially conquering was given to them by God. They did not build the houses they lived in. Their pottery they did not have to make at first. And with all the other material things they would find in the daily life, God had given them the spoils of the war. And further, they used cisterns they did not dig, enjoyed vineyards they did not plant, all compliments of their God. What a great example of coherence between the data surfaced from archaeological digs and the biblical story of how God provided for Israel as they initially entered the land of Canaan. I am perfectly at ease with a new breed of archaeologists calling for archaeological data to set the agenda for excavations or for regional surveys. However, I am not at ease with the tendency for modern archaeologists to dismiss the Bible completely or to treat it as some kind of unconscious revelation, whatever that means, or some so-called cultural document. As a man of faith who attempts to base the totality of my life on following the inspired Word of God, this kind of language used in reference to the Word of God, to the Bible, is totally unacceptable. My thesis calls upon archaeologists to give serious consideration to numerous and significant convergences, some clearly demonstrated and others that at least allow for the possibility of convergence, to allow the balance of probability or the preponderance of evidence to give credence to both disciplines, archaeology and the Bible, without dismissing the Bible outright. And when there is silence in both disciplines, realize that evidence offered from silence may also be interpreted in more ways than one. Now, Amy Mazar made that statement, and it's very true. I would also ask that all who are interested in the integration of the archaeological data and the biblical text to remember the words of Adam Zertal, spoken in 1991, and I quote, "In truth, even today, archaeology lies somewhere in the vague no man's land between natural sciences and the humanities. Although archaeology uses some modern technologies, many of its conclusions are drawn on the basis of intuition rather than objective measures. The quality of excavation, surveying, and publication of results is very uneven. He goes on to say, it is impossible to explore Israel's origins without the Bible. It is my hope and my prayer that my work, this thesis, has at least drawn attention to the fact that one should be even-handed with both the archaeological data and the biblical text when evaluating both cultural documents. My eclectic model does not answer all the questions associated with how ancient Israel emerged in Canaan. However, I hope it will serve as a starting point for those interested in the question to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.